Howdy, folks. It's your friend Max Mogren reporting live for you here at Wake Up News. This is Wake Up Wyoming. It's Friday, the 8th of September, 2017. And today we're taking a real hard look at hurricanes. Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Harvey, and Hurricane Jose out there in the Pacific. Okay? I don't know what to say about it. There's so much conflicting information out there about these hurricanes. On one side, you've got the mainstream media, folks like the Washington Post, Bloomberg. What are they saying? Well, they're all saying, oh, superstorms, we're going to see more and more of this, and it's due to climate change. They're so eager in the mainstream to link huge hurricanes like this to climate change. Then on the other side of the controlled debate, you got folks like Rush Limbaugh who are saying, oh, there's a conspiracy by the liberal media to use these storms to get people on board with the climate change agenda. Right? So there we see the two sides of the controlled debate in the mainstream. Then you got the kind of religious media. They're saying this is the end of days, the rapture. America's being punished for its horrible actions around the world. And, if you want to base your life on the Bible, go for it. But I don't think it's the end of the world. I think you got a lot going on, but the world's not going to end anytime soon. Natural disasters like this are horrible. Obviously, Hurricane Harvey causing $190 billion of damage to America's fourth largest city, Houston. 44 deaths attributed to it. It's a big deal. Now we got Hurricane Irma zeroing in on Florida. It looks like it's going to go right up Florida into the southeastern U.S., cause just a crap load of destruction there. Heartbreaking to see. But what's really going on here, right? And then outside the mainstream, you got folks like Dane Wigington at Geoengineering Watch. His most recent video came out 2 days ago on the topic of Hurricane Irma. Has about 120,000 views, a lot of shares. And Dane saying that these hurricanes are being brought in primarily to cool the eastern seaboard. In the midst, Dane Wigington, very outspoken, very prominent geoengineering researcher, but he bites the whole climate change due to CO2 agenda hook, line, and sinker, and says that these storms are being brought in primarily to cool the eastern seaboard and to disguise the catastrophic warming of the planet over the highest population centers of the U.S. to make it cool. Meanwhile, the western U.S. is huge drought, huge forest fires all over. I can't even see the mountains out here in Wyoming. It's hard to breathe because there's so much smoke due to the fires all over the West. And, Dane Wigington, I don't know what to make of that guy, but I think that he's kind of got the poison pill, so to speak. My old boss, Mike Rupert, used to say, somebody can say 95% truth, but then they sneak one lie in there. And in my opinion, Dane's big lie is the notion that these geoengineering programs are being used to disguise and slow climate change, when in reality, these are climate change technologies being used for lots of purposes. And Dane will say that too. His most recent video says that, but he bites the whole CO2-driven climate change agenda hook, line, and sinker. I used to buy that agenda hook, line, and sinker too, but then I read about it a little more, and I think that these geoengineering programs, this covert weather modification, covert climate modification, weather warfare is the big problem, much more so than CO2. And it's been going on for a very long time. Thank you all for tuning in. We're going to get into it. Again, there's so much conflicting information out there, it's hard to know what to believe. You go all over the internet, you don't know what, things change. You go on Wikipedia, things change. The mainstream media tells you one thing, the alternative media tells you another thing. So I tend to get my information from old books. And this is a book that I think you all will really enjoy. It's Impact, the Army Air Force's Confidential Picture History of World War II in 8 books, Volume 1. This book, 1943, okay? Now, one thing I've noticed and a lot of other people have noticed, if you're not clued into the whole geoengineering thing, the whole chemtrails thing, since the late 90s, more and more people have woken up to the disturbing presence of persistent, lingering trails coming out of the ass-end airplanes all over the world. These plane trails spread out into a high cirrus haze that obscures the sun and causes warming. Okay, it's important to note that the impact of cirrus clouds on weather and climate is a warming impact. And all the way back in May of 1943, the U.S. military knew how to prevent persistent trail formation. Okay, there you can see these B-17 bombers flying. To avoid telltale trails, see your meteorologist, May 1943. And it's important to put this out there because anybody who believes that all these crazy plane trails we see in the sky, all these weird repeating wave cloud patterns that some people like myself believe are attributed to electromagnetic manipulation of the atmosphere. You know, some people think, oh, those are just persistent contrails. You know, they're no big deal, blah, blah, blah. But all the way back in 1943, the U.S. military knew how to prevent those from forming. I'm going to read you this excerpt because it's important to note, if anybody doubts the notion that there are aerial spray programs manipulating our weather and climate, this should settle it. Again, this is Impact, the Army Air Force's confidential picture history of World War II. Streamers of frozen vapor from these B-17s reveal position and course of flight and form a natural cover for enemy pursuit planes. This is probably the exhaust type most common and most important. Aerodynamic trails flow off the wings and other parts of the plane in atmosphere of relatively high temperature and humidity, but are short and dissipating and relatively uncommon. Convection trails are formed by heat from engine gases. Exhaust trails usually occur at temperatures lower than negative 25 degrees Celsius and at temperate latitudes at altitudes from 25,000 to 40,000 feet. They form in or just above the tropopause. Okay, they got a little chart here of the tropopause. Very well understood back in the 40s. Height of the tropopause varies with the temperature and latitude. Exhaust trails almost never occur below the tropopause. They usually can be expected when high cirrus or cirrostratus clouds are seen. Exhaust trails result from condensation of moisture discharged as vapor from the engine exhaust. The hydrogen produced combines in the engine with oxygen from the air, forming 1.25 pounds of water for every pound of fuel used. When this vapor is expelled into air so cold that it can hold but little water as vapor, the humidity in the turbulent wake is raised beyond the saturation point and some of the water condenses into trails. The exhaust trails, once formed and observed, can be suppressed. Okay, how do you suppress the formation of these trails? Okay, 1943, the U.S. military already knew about it. The exhaust trails, once formed and observed, can be suppressed by climbing 1,500 feet or more into the stratosphere, by making a power-off glide into a lower level, or by making a power dive and regaining altitude by zooming. Exhaust and convection trails may be avoided by use of meteorological forecasting facilities so pilots can stay away from certain altitudes. Okay, so all the way back in 1943, we knew how to prevent persistent contrail formation. All it involves is getting out of the tropopause, flying up or down 1,500 vertical feet. So, you know, we live in this era where we're told there's catastrophic climate change going on, and we're told that clouds play a role in that. If the U.S. military, if the airlines, if they were really concerned about the impact of aviation on climate, they could reroute the planes and have them fly a little lower or a little higher and avoid persistent contrail formation. Instead, we see these big, billowing, lingering, spreading trails all over the world, creating cirrus clouds trapping heat, drastically affecting our weather and climate. Okay, so anybody that's on the fence about whether or not planes are being used to change the weather, change the climate, that should pretty much settle it right there. We've known how to prevent that for, 70 plus years. All it involves is flying a little lower or a little higher. Now, the history of weather modification, the question we're asking here today, why don't we weaken Irma and send it back out to sea? It's a reasonable question. We have the technology. And if anybody doesn't believe that, I'm going to try to prove it to you today. I got another good book here written by Nigel Calder. It's called The Weather Machine. And, I'm trying to elucidate the fact that these technologies exist. They could be used. So it's a very legitimate question. Maybe we should have a whitehouse.gov petition that says, hey, Trump, why don't you steer this hurricane back out to sea before it causes hundreds of billions of dollars of damage to Florida, loss of life, property damage, on and on and on. I could go on and on forever. But this topic, not that many people are aware of it. It's important that we get the message out. So I really appreciate all of you being here, helping get this message out. Anytime you can share this, any comments, any likes, very much appreciated. But let's get into the weather machine. Again, I don't trust much of the information I find online. That's why I go for these old books. This book, published in 1974. Okay, and it's shocking what we knew about the weather all the way back then, and how the mainstream media, all they focus on is CO2, methane, human activities. When they're talking about human activities that manipulate the climate, they only talk about CO2 and methane. But in reality, there are hundreds of organizations, be they governments, corporations, who have been playing God with the weather for a very long time. There are other factors as well, human factors like dust from agriculture, right? You till up a bunch of soil, it blows up into the air, you got dust, you have cloud condensation nuclei. That's going to cause weather changes, okay? You got aviation, you've got dams, you've got unnatural pooling of water in different locations. And this book really elucidates that. The history of weather modification, super duper fascinating. All the way back in 1961, this guy, JFK, in front of the UN, said, lavish international efforts in meteorology that were currently going on in 1974 have their origin in a single sentence in a speech by President John F. Kennedy to the General Assembly of the United Nations in September 1961. We shall propose further cooperative efforts between all nations in weather prediction and eventually weather control. Okay, that's JFK, 1961, in front of the UN. It goes on, and it's shocking. The history of weather modification, so fascinating. There was an experiment. If you go online and Google this, you're not going to find anything about this. Two acronyms, GARP, the Global Atmospheric Research Program, and GATE, the Global Atmospheric Tropospheric Experiment, which took place in 1974, right around the time when those huge droughts in sub-Saharan Africa really started taking off, back when people were dying in droves due to the droughts in Africa. That's the picture this book leads off with. A bunch of people in Senegal around an empty well dying. And they compare the effects of a major climate change would be comparable with a nuclear war. Okay? Humans have wanted to control the weather for a very long time, and now we have the computing power and the technology, be it chemical technologies, spraying chemicals in the upper atmosphere, or wireless electromagnetic manipulation of the atmosphere. These things do exist. These storms, Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Jose, could be steered out to sea. But to give you an idea of how secretive the history of weather modification is now, go online, try to find me anything about the GATE experiment in the Atlantic Ocean in 1974. The fashionable place to be in the summer of 1974, if you were a weatherman, was in the tropical Atlantic off West Africa, right west, just east of the Sahara, where these horrible droughts were just starting. An armada of 40 research ships from 10 nations, including 14 Russian ships, was gathered for the biggest single experiment in the history of science. But again, you can't find anything about the biggest experiment in the history of science online. At the airport at Dakar, Senegal, research aircraft laden with instruments shared the runway with occasional aircraft carrying relief supplies to the drought-stricken lands to the east. Dakar is the capital of Senegal, itself one of the countries most affected by the southward advance of the Sahara Desert. For 100 days in 1974, Dakar was the headquarters of GATE, the Atlantic Tropical Experiment, of the Global Atmospheric Research Program, GARP. Again, you can't find any info on GATE or GARP online, even though it was the largest experiment in the history of science. The extensive experiment and scientific work was relevant to the problem of famine in Africa only in a roundabout way, but it signals a new phase in human efforts to understand the weather of the tropics. What was GATE all about? The chief aim of GATE was to catch, in this box, a succession of the great clusters of clouds that occur in the tropics. The tropical areas are in fact the main boiler houses of the whole weather machine, absorbing the sun's rays and heating the air from below. The cloud clusters are strung out like rows of smoking chimneys across the ocean. So he goes on and on, kind of dances around the issue, but here we see there's a little diagram of the GATE armada out there, and he says, the Atlantic Tropical Experiment of the Global Atmospheric Research Program involved ships, aircraft, satellites, and weather stations deployed across a wide belt of the tropics. Research ships in the A and B scales off West Africa set a tighter trap for cloud clusters. Okay, they set a trap for cloud clusters. What were they doing? It was an experiment. They weren't observing, they were experimenting. I would venture to guess that they were causing the droughts in sub-Saharan Africa. But who knows? I could be wrong. You can't really find out much information on that because it doesn't exist online. Let's see. What else do we got? All this was preamble. Meteorology of today has its roots in the development of the 1960s as much as in anything that went before. We are in the era of the computer, 1974. But also in the era of the satellite and of unprecedented international cooperation. In the World Weather Watch organized by the World Meteorological Organization, virtually every country on Earth takes part, and for the simplest of reasons. The weather is a global process, and everyone needs everyone else's information. In the war against bad weather, the quarrelsome human species is more truly united than in any other activity. Okay, it's important to note, the war on weather. Okay, the war on weather. If we're going to have an enemy that's going to unite the entire human race, what's it going to be? Well, it could be aliens, right? We could do the whole Project Bluebeam thing, but a lot of people aren't going to believe that. And unless you got an alien knocking down your door or taking your daughter out on a date, you're probably not going to really buy that one. But climate change is a perfect way to unite all of humanity. And that's what we're seeing today. It's a global issue we all face, so says the mainstream media. Of course, the technologies to manipulate the climate have been around for a very long time, and arguably they are the primary cause of all the horrible weather we see. I'm going to keep going here for anybody that doubts the truth of this. On page 80, taking the offensive. This is all about weather modification. Back in 1974, again, the mainstream media, I challenge you to find me one article from a mainstream source where they ponder the questions we're pondering here today. Why don't we weaken Hurricane Irma and send it back out to sea? And why was Hurricane Harvey the most expensive American disaster of all time when the U.S. military has been experimenting with hurricane modification since at least 1961? But taking the offensive. The possibilities for human influences on weather and climate are legion. I could fill this book with them. One reason why I don't do so is the deep-rooted uncertainty among the experts. Here, very briefly, are some of the examples, besides man-made dust from agriculture and such, and carbon dioxide. Man-made heat, he talks about us burning all these fuels, cities, blacktop, all of that. High-flying aircraft. Artificial clouds in the form of condensation trails are familiar sights, right? Here I see, this is another good example. This is another edition of Impact, issue volume number 6 of the Confidential History of World War II. There you can see some lingering, spreading plane trails back in the 1940s. But artificial clouds in the form of condensation trails are familiar sights, 1974. Higher up, jet engines release into the dry, thin air of the stratosphere water vapor, carbon dioxide, and reactive compounds of nitrogen. It goes on and on. Intensive research on stratospheric chemistry is in progress in several countries, especially the United States. But the results may be rendered inconclusive by a discovery in Canada that the natural reactive nitrogen gases in the stratosphere vary enormously from hour to hour. Man-made deserts, he talks about dams. These examples lead us to the possibility of deliberate human action to alter the climate, of going over to the offensive in the war against bad weather. Melting the Arctic sea ice is, in fact, one of the possible objectives that scientists speculate about. You might do it by spreading soot on the ice, or by exploding H-bombs to make clouds at the right height to warm the Arctic, or by damming the Bering Strait between Siberia and Alaska and pumping water into the Pacific to draw the Gulf Stream further north on the far side of the pole. Another proposal is to water the desert by drawing the moist air upwards in huge plastic chimneys, 2 miles high and 300 feet wide, supported by a balloon. You could put huge mirrors or metal vapors into orbit around the Earth to capture some of the sun's rays that bypass the Earth. But all these ideas are fanciful at present, not just because of the technical and economic difficulties, but because no one can say what the consequences would really be. Okay, important to note there, back in 1974, they were proposing warming the Arctic, okay? The scientific consensus back in the 70s was that we were going into a new mini ice age. And in this book, he's like, thank God that we're burning all this fossil fuel because it's going to prevent us from going into a new ice age, okay? It's wild. Again, this is a very mainstream book published in 1974 by Viking Press, and it was made into a BBC special, okay? Moving along, though, other particles promote ice formation in colder air higher in the cloud, and most of the world's rain is melted snow. In the 1930s, in the Netherlands and Germany, the idea of helping nature with precipitation by supplying nuclei artificially was pursued, but without success. In 1946, 2 scientists working for General Electric in Schenectady, New York, pioneered cloud seeding. Vincent Schaefer promoted ice formation in clouds using dry ice, and then Bernard Vonnegut came up with silver iodide. Bernard Vonnegut, the brother of famous author, I'm a big fan, Kurt Vonnegut. This material, silver iodide, dispensed as a smoke from very small crystals from burners or from fireworks, is still the prime agent of weather modification. It goes on and on, talks about how they had such success in South Dakota, goes on and on and on. Whatever the verdict may be, and even this careful experiment cannot satisfy everyone, cloud seeding by silver iodide is undoubtedly the right kind of idea if man is ever to control the climate. It is a trigger exploiting the tendency of the atmosphere to produce effects that far outstrip the cause. In this case, by releasing the energy and moisture already latent in the droplets that are overdue for freezing. Once the energy has been released, it can, in principle, create an updraft that makes the cloud go on growing in a more natural fashion. Okay? So you see some hubris there. They talk about this like, oh yeah, we can do this. This is good stuff. But moving on. Getting into the real meat of it here today. Project Storm Fury. Okay? The first big hurricane modification program by the U.S. government took place in 1947, which was, not coincidentally, 1 year after Bernard Vonnegut and Dr. Schaefer at GE patented cloud seeding. Okay, less than a year later, the U.S. government attempted to steer a hurricane with cloud seeding. And that was 1947. It was called Project Cirrus. Okay? If anybody thinks I'm crazy for bringing this up, back, here we go. 1947. The U.S. Department of Defense conducts Project Cirrus, in which about 200 pounds of dry ice was dropped into a hurricane headed back out to sea. The hurricane abruptly changed course and slammed into Savannah, Georgia. The public blamed the government for this catastrophe, so future storm modification experiments took place more secretly. Once again, we see a brand new technology being used in an attempt to alter the weather in massive ways. And you can see, if you go online, you can find a summary PDF of Project Cirrus. Okay? And then the big thing happened, 1961. Project Storm Fury began in 1961 and lasted until 1983. At the same time, Project Skyfire began. That was a study into lightning manipulation. You know, there are obvious reasons why you'd want to decrease or perhaps increase the amount of lightning in the sky. And then Project Storm Fury in hurricane manipulation. This book, The Weather Machine, 1974, by Nigel Calder, has a great section. Are typhoons necessary? On a wet afternoon in the Philippines, Air Force Base outside Manila, the colonels spoke of their plans to fight typhoons. Typhoons, the same as hurricanes. A hurricane in the South Pacific is called a typhoon. So it's the same sort of thing. The greatest storms on Earth. They showed me first the four-seater Cessna 210 aircraft, which were kept busy seeding clouds to supplement the nation's water resources by rainmaking. Okay, so the Philippines had a fleet of Cessnas they used to supplement the nation's water resources with cloud seeding. They could hardly take on a typhoon. Then the colonels pointed to a big C-130 Hercules aircraft standing on the runway. From the Americans, the Marcos government, that's the government of the Philippines, is buying 2 such aircraft to be in action by 1975, thoroughly fitted out with meteorological instruments. Even more to the point, the Filipinos have bought a belief that the C-130s will be the embodiment of, the belief that typhoons can be tamed. In 1973, a Typhoon Moderation Council was set up by Filipino presidential decree. Of all the world's major countries, the Philippines Republic is the most battered by tropical storms because it sprawls across the main highway of the Pacific. Typhoons. In an average year, 19 of them hit one or other of the major islands comprising the nation. In December 1944, just off of the Philippines, a typhoon intervened in the Pacific War, catching a huge American fleet in the midst of refueling at sea. The raging water swept the flight decks of the carriers, made battleships heave to, and sank 3 destroyers with all hands. Okay, 1944. You know, there's a very clear and present and obvious reason why the government would want to control the weather. They lost a bunch of ships during World War II to what? To a typhoon. September, October, November 1970, a succession of 4 typhoons struck the islands unusually hard and killed 1,500 people. Patsy, the last of the 4, hit Manila. Since then, the Civilian Weather Service of the Philippines has accelerated its research into typhoons, and the Typhoon Moderation Council is now looking to the Americans for assistance. After all, the U.S. Project Storm Fury, which began in 1961, 13 years before this book was written in 1974, was what raised the Filipinos' hopes. If man is to put the world's climate to rights, is this not a good place to begin? About once a week, somewhere in the tropics, the straggling cloud cluster begins to arrange itself in a sinister fashion. Goes on and on, talking about how hurricanes and typhoons are formed. The great storms are called typhoons in the North Pacific, hurricanes in the Atlantic, and cyclones in the Indian Ocean and Australia. They are all one species, the tropical cyclones, but the most savage are to be found among the Pacific typhoons and the deadliest among the Indian Ocean typhoons. So he's talking, you know, they're the same. That's the important thing to note. Typhoons, hurricanes, all the same. And the U.S. military, all the way back in 1961, even earlier back in 1947, was attempting to manipulate typhoons. Sorry, the camera's fritzing out here. Let's see if that helps. Goes on, storm surge. The Japanese also attempting to manipulate typhoons. Well, let's get to the meat of this. And this is fascinating. This explains exactly what they're doing. But from an aircraft flying into the eye, as American hurricane hunters do routinely, One sees a coliseum of mighty clouds surrounding the eye and towering 35 to 40,000 feet high. This eye wall is the chief engine of the storm, the vortex where the wind screams loudest as it whirls around the eye and whips the ocean water into a blinding cream of spray. Wind speeds of over 100 knots are quite usual. Okay, important to note, Hurricane Irma forecast to be, I'm not sure if it already has, but they're saying it's a Class 6 hurricane. I don't think there's ever been a Class 6 before. This is the strongest hurricane of all time. Why are we having this if we've been experimenting with manipulating hurricanes and typhoons since the 1940s? It goes on and on. Let's see. Sometimes the needs of safety conflict with good taste. The Florida coast will be safer for its inhabitants and visitors when robust high-rise hotels and apartment blocks replace the little houses and motels. Then, when the hurricane brings its storm surge, you carry your martini upstairs. Okay, there's a little hubris back in the 1970s right there. So the argument for taming tropical cyclones is economic rather than humanitarian. When Project Storm Fury started in the United States in 1961 as a joint effort of the U.S. Navy and Department of Commerce, the mood of the time favored a technological fix for the world's ills. It seemed entirely reasonable to confront the impertinent and exorbitant hurricanes with human ingenuity. Would anyone who succeeded in defeating the storms not deserve well of mankind? Two main notions about how to do it have persisted over the years. Okay? One is to cut off the storm's fuel supply, the water vapor from the ocean, by painting the sea with a chemical film. The drawback is likely to be the storm's manifest capacity for stirring the ocean's surface. The chief idea in Project Storm Fury is to seed the cyclone with silver iodide smoke on the outside edge of the eye wall. The object is to release heat and build clouds that will spread out the zone of high winds, so weakening them and the whole storm. Rough tests were carried out in 1961 with Hurricane Esther and 1963 Hurricane Beulah, but the principal experiment was in 1969. Aircraft seeded Hurricane Debbie on the 18th of August, and the maximum wind at 12,000 feet dropped from 98 to 68 knots. During the following day, the storm recovered, and on the third day, the 20th of August, a repetition of the seeding reduced the wind from 99 to 84 knots. So right there, 1969, the U.S. government, according to Nigel Calder in The Weather Machine, published in 1974 by Viking Press, made into a special on the BBC, Project Storm Fury succeeded in weakening Hurricane Debbie. Cloud seeding, dropping the wind speeds from 98 to 68 knots. That's huge. And then they did it again, dropping it from 99 to 84 knots. It was encouraging, to say the least. Cecil Chantry, director of the National Hurricane Research Laboratory in Miami, told me that when he took the job in 1966, he thought the odds against modifying hurricanes were long. Now he thinks there's an even chance of success. But the credibility of the techniques depends in part on the supply of water droplets overdue for freezing, ready to turn into ice when the seeding is done. In September 1973, Hurricane Ellen streamed northwards across the Atlantic east of Bermuda. 2 American research craft flew into it on behalf of the National Hurricane Research Laboratory. One of them, a C-130, that's a big military plane, was the most thoroughly equipped aircraft ever to penetrate a hurricane. There were 6 different instruments for measuring water droplets and ice particles. Sinkable thermometers dropped from the aircraft gave evidence of deep-lying waves in the sea in the wake of the hurricane. But most important for the Storm Fury theory was the discovery of even greater quantities of liquid water in the clouds at temperatures below the freezing point than the experimenters had hoped to find. But by then, Storm Fury was in temporary decline. The U.S. Navy pulled out of the project in 1972, and the civilian funds were going largely into preparing new aircraft and instruments. And because Atlantic hurricanes are comparatively rare, the project was adjourning to Guam. You know, we heard so much about Guam recently, the fear of North Korea nuking Guam. Well, that's where we were doing our hurricane experimenting back in the 70s, where typhoons abound. and seeding would resume in 1976. Meanwhile, two kinds of meteorological critics confront the would-be storm busters. So, there you go, right? The technology to manipulate hurricanes, to weaken them, to strengthen them, to steer them, was already being carried out with relative success back in the 1960s, 1970s, up until the 80s. Now, if anybody thinks those programs stopped, I beg to differ. And it's important to note, what has happened since the 1960s and 70s? Well, we've gotten much better at chemistry, nanotechnology, electromagnetics, computing, computer modeling. The technologies have all increased. And what we see, you can go online, there's so much information on this topic. There are literally dozens of patents out there for various weather modification technologies. You know, we could steer these storms. We could prevent these storms from making landfall. We could weaken these storms. And this is good too. Again, you know, I mentioned earlier the impact of aviation, the impact of artificially induced cloud cover on the weather and climate. These days, you know, we're told by the mainstream media, oh, CO2 is the problem. These models say this. 100 years from now, we're all going to be dead because of CO2, and it's all your fault. You know, you're burning all this fossil fuel, and shame on you. But what they don't acknowledge, at least not very openly, is that their climate models do not factor in cloudiness. They do not factor in the most powerful greenhouse gas of all, which is water vapor. Way back in 1974, Nigel Calder and the scientific consensus of the time knew this. Perhaps the biggest single shortcoming of climate models is the failure of model-to-model changing patterns of cloudiness. The clouds threaten to be the Achilles heel of numerical models for climate. A surprising discovery by satellite illustrates the importance of clouds. The southern hemisphere absorbs no more or no less heat from the sun than does the northern hemisphere, despite the immense preponderance of ocean in the south. Only a massive correction to meteorologists' expectations about the cloudiness of the southern hemisphere can account for the balance. One of the difficulties in dealing with cloudiness in numerical models is technical, having to do with the mass of the clouds being minute, while their effects are great. But there is also too little knowledge in the typical behavior of the different kinds of clouds in different settings. For instance, high clouds, like cirrus clouds, have a warming effect below, while in other places, lower clouds have a cooling effect. Okay, can't stress that enough. Anytime you see the airplanes flying overhead, leaving the big, lingering, spreading trails that form a high cirrus haze, that has a warming impact. You can feel it, right? If it's a dreary day, if there's a thick stratus cloud, it's going to be colder. There's not going to be as much sun. You're not going to cast a shadow. But if there's a high wispy cirrus haze, you go outside. You might still need sunglasses on, right? It's still pretty bright, so you got to keep your shades on because about 90% of the sun's rays get through that high cirrus haze. But at the same time, the infrared that would radiate back out into space is trapped by that blanket of ice. Okay? Can't stress that enough. So anytime you see those high wispy clouds, it's making it warmer than it would be otherwise. And when you read mainstream reports where they say, well, we're proposing geoengineering to mitigate. They want to mitigate climate change with geoengineering. Mitigate, a funny word, isn't it? What does mitigate mean? Well, we're going to change the climate. We're going to protect you from climate change with geoengineering by changing the climate, right? Mitigating climate change means changing the climate. And anytime you see those high wispy cirrus hazes, that's trapping heat. That's making it warmer here on planet Earth, okay? So think about that when the mainstream tries to sell you the geoengineering agenda. This book, I could go on and on in here, but it's fascinating. It's old, older than me, and it's real. Another great book, this book I always cite, The Body Electric, by Robert O. Becker, MD, and Gary Selden. All the way back in 1985, this was written. Very illuminating on the electromagnetic pollution, the electromagnetic impact of things like smart meters, Wi-Fi, cell phones, radio stations, military installations, on and on and on. But All the way back in 1985, he was concerned that people were electromagnetically manipulating the weather. This guy's a doctor, one of the pioneering researchers at the veterans hospitals in the U.S. into the electromagnetic nature of human life. Satellite measurements have proven that artificial energies from power lines are similarly amplified high above the Earth, a phenomenon known as power line harmonic resonance. Radio and microwave energy also resonates in the magnetosphere. This amplified energy interacts with the particles in the Van Allen belts, producing heat, light, X-rays, and most important, a fallout of charged particles that serve as nuclei for raindrops, okay, using electromagnetic pollution to create cloud condensation nuclei. Recent work with sounding rockets has matched specific areas of such ion precipitation with the energy from specific radio stations and established that the shifting down of charged particles generally occurs east of the electromagnetic radiation source, following the general eastward drift of weather patterns. In 1983, measures from the Ariel 3 and 4 weather satellites showed that the enormous amount of power line harmonic resonance over North America had created a permanent duct from the magnetosphere down into the upper air, resulting in a continuous release of ions and energy over the whole continent. In presenting this data at the March 1983 Symposium on Electromagnetic Compatibility in Zurich, Switzerland, Kay Bullough reminded the audience that thunderstorms have been 25% more frequent over North America between 1930 and 1975 than they were from 1900 to 1930, and suggested that the increased energy levels in the upper atmosphere were responsible. Since the mid-1970s, there has been a dramatic increase in flooding, drought, and attendant hardships due to inconsistent anomalous weather patterns. It appears likely that these have been caused in part by electropollution and perhaps enhanced, whether deliberately or not, by the Soviet woodpecker signal. If you don't know what that is, super fascinating. Google the Soviet woodpecker. It was the Russians experimenting with electromagnetic warfare back in the 1970s. It now seems feasible to induce catastrophic climate change over a target country, and even without such weather warfare, continued expansion of the electrical power system threatens the viability of all life on Earth. Robert O. Becker, MD, one of the most brilliant minds of his generation. Rest in peace, Robert O. Becker. But this is mainstream, okay? If we're going to have a legitimate debate about climate change, we're not going to find it in the mainstream media because they're not going to address weather modification at all. They don't address geoengineering, covert, wide-scale weather modification, climate modification. And even here, you can have unintentional weather modification due to the power grid. Of course, if you can have it unintentionally due to electromagnetic resonance, power line harmonic resonance, you can have it intentionally due to things like HAARP, due to things like NEXRAD. Okay, so Robert O. Becker, MD, God bless you. Kick-ass book right there. I got one more book, one old book here, just a quick little excerpt from here. Weather of the San Francisco Bay Area by Harold Gilliam of the University of California Press, published in 1961. Just a quick little excerpt here. Man has not yet fulfilled his age-old dream of controlling the weather, but in the Bay region he comes close. Okay, so it goes on and on. Point being, meteorologists from the California public university system back in 1961 acknowledging man's age-old quest to control the weather. It's really important to note that it's the perfect weapon. It's like having nukes, except you can actually use them. Why? Because there's plausible deniability. If the weather's bad, if there's a drought over Iran or there's a drought over Syria or a huge hurricane hits the U.S., whose fault is it, right? Well, who can we blame? The mainstream media is going to blame climate change, right? Guys like Rush Limbaugh, the climate change denying media are going to blame God. People who are Bible thumpers to the nth degree are going to think it's the end of the world. But it's not. And then you got people like me who think, wow, there's so many things going on here. What if it's intentional? And what if instead of weakening these storms, instead of steering these storms back out to sea, these storms are being enhanced, augmented, and pushed in to the coast to cause horrible damage, horrible loss of life, horrible loss of property, ecological catastrophes. Okay, prior to Hurricane Harvey, the greatest hurricane, the most expansive hurricane in the U.S. history was Katrina in New Orleans. Hurricane Harvey, so damaging because it dropped 52 inches of rain in some places, which is a new record. And what was really strange about Harvey is that hurricane just sat in one spot on the coast of Texas, right off Corpus Christi, with the eye right offshore, picking up all this moisture and dumping it on the coast, right? With all-time record rains. With the technologies that have been developed since the 1940s to manipulate hurricanes, typhoons, whatever you want to call them, they could have pushed that storm into shore. Once the eye goes over land, the engine dies, right? It kills the source of power and moisture for the hurricane because it's not circulating over the ocean anymore, right? Instead, it sure looked like that hurricane was just held in one spot. I could go on and on and on this topic because there literally is so much information out there. If anybody still doubts the fact that these technologies exist, I'm going to read you a couple choice excerpts from something I put together years ago. It's a timeline history of weather modification. And it's funny, Dane Wigington, the folks at Geoengineering Watch, actually copied and pasted this off of my website, put it up on their site, didn't attribute it to me at all. I got it from, what's his name, Nick Begich. I compiled a bunch of things from Nick Begich. He's the guy behind Angels Don't Play This Harp. I got some information from What in the World Are They Spraying? I got some information from Jim Lee at Climate Viewer, and I put it all together in one convenient, easy-to-read thing. Again, 1946, that's when cloud seeding with silver iodide and dry ice was developed. Project Cirrus, 1947, shortly after cloud seeding was discovered. What did the U.S. military do? They tried to steer a hurricane, and it abruptly changed course and slammed into Savannah, Georgia. But I would bet they got a lot better at steering hurricanes since that point in time. 1951 to 1953, the U.S. Department of Defense conducts the Artificial Cloud Nucleation Project, AEN, a large-scale weather modification project in Washington. 1952, the U.S. White House Department of Weather Modification was formed. 1952 to 1954, Project Scud, the U.S. government experiment with cloud seeding over the east coast of the United States. 1953, President Eisenhower creates the U.S. Advisory Committee on Weather Control. 1953-1954, scientists at New York University seed 19 cyclones. 1956, the U.S. Weather Bureau initiates the National Hurricane Research Project. This is a long time ago, guys. They've been studying this stuff for a long time. 1958, Chief White House Advisor on Weather Modification, Captain Howard T. Orville, said the Department of Defense was studying ways to manipulate the charges of the earth and sky and so affect the weather by using an electronic beam to ionize or deionize the atmosphere over a given area. This is Nikola Tesla's death ray, and they were experimenting with it almost 60 years ago. 1958, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, a future U.S. president, made a prophetic opening statement at the hearings before the Preparedness Investigating Subcommittee of the Committee of Armed Services. Whew, that's a mouthful. But here's what Senator Lyndon B. Johnson had to say in 1958 before he became president. From space, this is pretty powerful stuff here that old LBJ was saying. Check this out. From space, the masters of infinity would have the power to control the Earth's weather, to cause drought and flood, to change the tides and raise the levels of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream and change temperate climates to frigid. There is something more important than the ultimate weapon, and that is the ultimate position, the position of total control over the Earth that lies somewhere in outer space. In essence, the Soviet Union has appraised control of space as a goal of such consequence that achievement of such control has been made a first aim of Soviet national policy. In contrast, our decisions, more often than not, have been made within the framework of the government's annual budget. Against this view, we now have on record the appraisal of leaders in the field of science, respected men of unquestioned competence, whose valuation of what control of outer space means renders irrelevant the bookkeeping concerns of fiscal officers. So what's LBJ saying there? He's saying, guys, it might seem like a big waste of money, but we have to invest in the technology to become the masters of infinity, with the power to control the Earth's weather, to cause drought and flood, to change the tides and raise the levels of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream and change temperate climates to frigid. Okay, that's LBJ, 1958. You know, you think they've been at it for a while? I think so. Again, then what happens? 1960, 1961, Project Skyfire, attempting to manipulate lightning. Project Storm Fury, attempting to manipulate hurricanes. Okay? Important to note as well, beginning in 1967 until 1972, the U.S. military conducted covert weather warfare over Vietnam with an operation called Popeye, attempting to extend the monsoon season over Laos, specifically areas of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The operation seeded clouds with silver iodide, resulting in the targeted areas seeing an extension of the monsoon period, an average of 30 to 45 days annually. Okay, they were able to extend the monsoon period over Vietnam and Laos by 35 to 45 days. Also credited with increasing overall precipitation by 30%. As the continuous rainfall slowed down truck traffic, it was considered relatively successful. The 54th Weather Reconnaissance Squadron carried out the operation to make mud, not war. Okay, so that Operation Popeye, again, that was conducted with zero government oversight for 7 years during the Vietnam War. It didn't come out until years later. Who was that famous senator? I can't remember, but it was a big stink when it came out. But people seem to forget. 1968, chair of the ICAS Select Panel on Weather and Climate Modification, Gordon J.F. MacDonald, authored a chapter in his book, Unless Peace Comes, where he correctly predicted the future means of obtaining national objectives by force hinges on man's ability to control and manipulate the environment of planet Earth. When achieved, this is a quote from Gordon J.F. MacDonald, who is government guy, chair of the ICAS Select Panel on Weather and Climate Modification. When achieved, this power over his environment will provide man with a new force capable of doing great and indiscriminate damage. Our present primitive understanding of deliberate environmental change makes it difficult to imagine a world in which geophysical warfare is practiced. Such a world might be one in which nuclear weapons were effectively banned, and the weapons of mass destruction were those of environmental catastrophe. As I will argue, these weapons are peculiarly suited for covert or secret wars. Okay, the next year, Gordon J.F. MacDonald, head of this committee, wrote as follows in Toward the Year 2018. By the year 2018, and we're almost there, aren't we? Technology will make available to the leaders of the major nations a variety of techniques for conducting secret warfare, of which only a bare minimum of the security forces need be appraised. One nation may attack a competitor covertly through bacteriological means, through thoroughly weakening the population, though with a minimum of fatalities. Okay, so he's advocating germ warfare. Of course, electromagnetic warfare does the same thing. Alternatively, techniques of weather modification could be employed to produce prolonged periods of drought or storm, thereby weakening a nation's capacity and forcing it to accept the demands of a competitor. Okay, 1968. Head honchos. You want to hear another head honcho? You might have heard of this guy, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the author of The Grand Chessboard. If you want to read something that'll piss you off, read that book. Arguably, he was one of the architects of 9/11, the greatest false flag attack ever perpetuated by a government against its nation. Although I have to say, these hurricanes that could be steered, these hurricanes that could be weakened and sent out to sea using technologies that were developed decades ago, are arguably worse than 9/11, right? Because they kill lots of people. Hurricane Katrina killed 1,500 people. 9/11 killed about 3,000 people. But the economic impact of Katrina was $125 billion. The economic impact of Hurricane Harvey, $180, $190 billion, right? The most expensive natural disaster of all time in the United States. The economic impact of Irma, we're just going to have to see. But if you're like me, I think we should weaken Irma, send her back out to sea, because we can. The technology exists. My question is why? We're going to get to that in a little while with the Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. But first, I'm going to keep going through the history of weather modification, select excerpts. Now, the whole history of weather modification, it's impossible to compile because there are all these different actors doing it in secret. Countries like Russia, China, the U.S., NATO. The list goes on and on. Different countries have got different patent offices. They've got different covert operations. It's impossible to compile the entire history of weather modification. But I got a pretty good chunk of it here on the smartphone. 1970, U.S. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's still very active in 2012. Is he dead yet? I hope so. But he published Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era, containing the following informative quote. Not only have new weapons been developed, but some of the basic concepts of geography and strategy have been fundamentally altered. Space and weather control have replaced Suez, the Suez Canal, and the Rock of Gibraltar as key elements of strategy. Okay, you used to want to control the Suez Canal, the Rock of Gibraltar. You wanted your navy there because it was a huge choke point for global trade, right? Well, in 1970, Zbigniew Brzezinski already says that the basic concepts of geography and strategy have been fundamentally altered. Space and weather control have replaced, not will replace, have replaced Suez and Gibraltar as key elements of strategy. Future developments may well include automated or manned space warships, deep sea installations, chemical and biological weapons, death rays, and still other forms of warfare. Even the weather may be tampered with. Okay, 1970, Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the biggest D-bags in the history of the planet. 1974, the U.S. Department of Defense tells Project Storm Fury research to conduct, quote, more field experiments on tropical cyclones at every opportunity. Okay, it's important to note, when we were perfecting these technologies, when the U.S. military, the U.S. DOD, Department of Defense, pretty funny name for the global terrorist organization killing people all over the world, they did it over in the Philippines. They did it over in Guam, right? They weren't going to fiddle with this shit too much on American soil. But now, 43 years later, the technology pretty well far along. Then it had progressed to the point where it was such a big deal that in 1978, the United Nations General Assembly banned environmental warfare, space-based weapons in Antarctica, through the ENMOD Treaty, ENMOD, Environmental Modification Treaty. Of course, the UN has also banned things like torture. And white phosphorus, right? They banned torture. But that doesn't stop the U.S. government from enhanced interrogation techniques And it doesn't stop us from using white phosphorus on places like Fallujah, right? 1975, the Soviets begin pulsing woodpecker ELF waves at key brainwave rhythms. Eugene, Oregon was one of the locations where people were particularly affected. Russia begins generating powerful electromagnetic transmissions, which are dubbed the Russian woodpecker by Western ham radio operators. Okay, we talked about the woodpecker here in the body electric. By 1985, people were concerned that the woodpecker was not only screwing up people's brains, but it was also affecting the weather. And again, a little more on NMOD. Again, the UN Environmental Modification Convention, NMOD, 1978, formally the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques, prohibits the military and other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. It opened for signature on the 18th of May, 1977, and entered into force on the 5th of October, 1978. The convention bans weather warfare, which is the use of weather modification techniques for the purposes of inducing damage or destruction. Okay? So if the U.S. military, if the deep state, the military-industrial complex, whoever it is causing these earthquakes, is enhancing these earthquakes, is steering these earthquakes, is using them as a form of disaster capitalism or as a way to destroy America or hinder us economically or make a bunch of money through the rebuilding process, that's an act of war. And it's been banned by the UN for 40 years. So it'd be pretty cool if instead of these hurricanes causing unprecedented damage, why don't we just send them back out to sea and weaken them, right? 1983, Project Storm Fury officially ends after 20 years of experimentation into predicting and modifying hurricanes. Then shit gets real crazy. 1987, Bernard Eastlund authors U.S. Patent 4686605 and two others, in which he references Tesla's work as a source of historical contribution. It is entitled, his patent, Method and Apparatus for Altering a Region in the Earth's Atmosphere, Ionosphere, and or Magnetosphere. Part of it reads, the patent, Bernard Eastlund, weather modification is possible by altering upper atmospheric wind patterns and altering solar absorption patterns by constructing one or more plumes of particles which will act as a lens or focusing device. Years later, Bernard Eastlund admits in an interview to having approached the Pentagon with his ideas, but says he is not at liberty to disclose the outcome. His device would allow a concentration of 1 watt per cubic centimeter, compared to others only able to deliver 1/millionth of a watt. Then in 1993, work began on the HAARP research station. I'm sure everybody knows about that. There's a lot of stuff like HAARP out there. 1994, the U.S. Air Force reveals its Spacecast 2020 master plan, which includes weather control. Scientists have experimented with weather control since the 1940s, but Spacecast 2020 noted that using environmental modification techniques to destroy, damage, or injure another state is prohibited. Having said that, the Air Force claimed that advances in technology compels a re-examination of this sensitive and potentially risky topic. Okay? That's 23 years ago. 1995. And this is really important here. I don't know about you, but when I was in 1995, I was a freshman in high school back in Minnesota. And I started to notice that the winters were not near as cold or snowy as they used to be. And right around that time, public complaints accumulate across the U.S. regarding unusual cloud formations and a sudden increase in observable persistent jet contrails that appear unnaturally under dry atmospheric conditions. These observations are accompanied by complaints of biological specimens and web formations that appear from the sky. Many instances of qualified lab analysis reveal high concentrations of aluminum, barium, and other elements that are consistent with Department of Defense electromagnetic experiments. Okay, that's 1995. That's the infancy of the internet. A lot of the original public complaints accumulating across the U.S. about persistent jet trails have been scrubbed. They're gone. You can't find them. But that's when it started happening. 1996, the U.S. Air Force publishes Weather as a Force Multiplier, owning the weather, but in 2025. If you haven't read that document, you should really check it out. They call it a research paper. It's hypothetical. But at the same time, a lot of the stuff that they say in that paper has come to pass. And the technologies that are out there, I see no reason why the government would not make use of these technologies, considering it is the most, it's godlike capability. And look, what's going on in the world today? People are playing God with the food supply, right? Genetic engineering, horrible pesticides. People are playing God with the financial markets, creating wealth out of nothing, printing money, giving it to themselves, driving down everybody else's salaries and purchasing power through the horrible hidden tax of inflation, right? People are playing God with human genetics, right? Trying to make designer babies, shit like that. People are playing God with nanotechnology, creating nanobots, microscopic virus-like structures that are essentially synthetic forms of life, right? People are playing God with drones. Drone warfare gives you the godlike power where at absolutely no risk to yourself, no risk of physical harm to you, you can send a little computer-guided plane halfway around the world and it's going to drop a Hellfire missile and blow somebody up, right? They're playing God like that. So why, I ask you, would they not play God with the weather when the technology has been developed over the last century? Okay? Where are we here? 1996. And it's important to note, too, in the midst of all this, we haven't had a major hurricane make landfall in the United States since 2005. Okay, there's been a 12-year drought for major hurricanes. Yeah, there have been some tropical storms. There have been a few hurricanes, but nothing major. You can confirm this statement I'm making in the mainstream media, right? The Washington Post reported on it 2 days ago. It's like, why, after 12 years with no hurricanes, why do we have 3 really bad ones, Harvey, Irma, and Jose, all stacked up, right? But back in 2005, what did we have? Hurricane Katrina made landfall in Louisiana on August 29, resulting in devastation and loss of life of historic proportions across the Gulf Coast. Katrina resulted in an estimated $125 billion in damages, making it the most expensive natural disaster in U.S. history, and approximately 1,833 deaths, the highest U.S. total since the 1928 hurricane in southern Florida. So I misspoke earlier. There were actually 1,800 deaths in Katrina, right? If the technology exists to prevent these, if the technology exists to cause these, and the U.S. military they certainly have the budget, and they have the technology, they developed it, and they don't do anything to steer these, or in fact, they cause these, isn't that an act of war? Isn't the Department of Defense supposed to be defending the homeland from all threats? Well, so why are we having record-breaking natural disasters? Again, Hurricane Rita that same year, $16 billion in damages, 119 deaths. Hurricane Wilma, another $16 billion in damages and 35 deaths. Overall, the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season set several records. There were 28 named storms. In addition, there were an unprecedented 14 hurricanes, of which 7 were major hurricanes, Category 3 or higher on the scale. 3 Category 5 hurricanes formed the Atlantic Basin for the first time in a single season, and 4 major hurricanes and 3 tropical storms made landfall in the U.S., with an 8th storm, Ophelia, brushing the North Carolina coast. Okay? Also important to note that in 2009, the Department of Homeland Security started Operation HAMP, specifically designed to modify and steer hurricanes with geoengineering aerosols. Okay? So almost 10 years ago, 8 years ago, the Department of Homeland Security started Operation HAMP, designed to steer hurricanes. After all this evidence I piled up here, what's the deal? Why do we have, for the first time ever, these unprecedented storms? A Category 6 hurricane, that's a new category. 52 inches of rain in Houston, that's a new record. But we have the technologies to steer these storms. We have the technologies to prevent these storms. So what gives? You know, I haven't really gotten into the comments here. I'm sure a lot of people, man, there's a lot of comments. Thank you so much. We have 131 shares. Thank you. But the reason we're finally getting around to answer it, I think it's contained in the shock doctrine by Naomi Klein. Two key things: disaster capitalism. My old boss, Michael C. Rupert, when I was his assistant, I worked with him for 18 months before his untimely death in 2014. I think he died. But I was working with him in 2011, 2012. And one thing he repetitively said was, we live in an era where it's more profitable to destroy things than it is to build them. And there's a lot of truth to that. And think about it. If you feed people a bunch of toxic food and you blast them with radiation through their cell phones, Wi-Fi, smart meters, and they get cancer, well, that's pretty profitable, because the average cancer, you know, most bankruptcies in the U.S. are due to medical bills. I don't know what the average cost is per person who gets diagnosed with cancer, but it's a lot of money. It's very profitable to make people sick, right? Or they say there's no profit in healthy people, there's no profit in dead people. You want them somewhere in the middle there, right? So as an example, you destroy human health, it's very profitable, right? War is profitable. These books, these old Impact, the Army Air Force's Confidential Picture History of World War II, for some reason, back then, our great-grandfathers thought it would be a great idea to carpet bomb all of Europe, Japan, these books are shocking. You look through here, and they'll show you like a before and after of a city, some beautiful city like Dresden that got firebombed, and they say, look how good our boys in blue did. They destroyed this whole city. That'll show those Japs. That'll show those, that'll show those Nazis. But it's like, you guys are blowing up entire cities. You're killing hundreds of thousands of innocent people. Why? Because it's profitable. Because it's all about power and money and control. So there's another example of it being more profitable to destroy things than to build them. And it's the same thing with these natural disasters. As Naomi Klein argues in the shock doctrine, which is about 10 years old, something like Katrina. What happens when Katrina happened? Well, a whole bunch of people lost their homes. And people who had a bunch of money were able to buy up all that real estate for pennies on the dollar. The government was able to gift itself a whole bunch of money for reconstructing and disaster recovery efforts, right? What happens to all that money? Well, it gets funneled off to various corporations. They make a bunch of money. Is the average person who went through Hurricane Katrina doing better than they were then? Probably not, unless they had a bunch of money to begin with and they were able to take over portions of the city that were predominantly black and impoverished and turn it into fucking Disneyland, right? Same sort of thing's probably going on in Houston. I'd like to head down there and see what's going on myself, but it's not in the cards immediately here. I'm going to wrap this up pretty quick here unless people have any other questions. This video as well, I've got a lot of sources here, and what I'm going to do after we wrap up this video, I'm going to go through, put this timeline history online, put together a bunch of sources on the history of weather modification, some choice quotes from the shock doctrine. I'm going to post it all on wakeupnews.net. But I had to get this video out just to let people know, hey, in the midst of the public dialogue here, where on one side You got Rush Limbaugh, the conservative climate change deniers. You got your Donnie Trumps of the world. They're saying, oh, this isn't climate change. This is just God at work. This is a natural disaster. And then on the other side of the controlled debate in the mainstream, you got Bloomberg, Washington Post, the liberal media. They're saying, wow, this is clear and present evidence of climate change. And it's all due to CO2. It's all your fault for burning fossil fuels. Meanwhile, oil prices are up. We're investing more money into more pipelines, more tar sands, more fracking. But in reality, we don't need fossil fuels. We could have been off fossil fuels before we ever got onto them if the technologies of visionary inventors like Nikola Tesla were implemented over 100 years ago. I can't stress that enough. So you got your climate change deniers, you got your climate change doom fearmongers, and then you got normal, sane human beings like all the rest of us who are like, wow, there's a lot going on. There are a lot of factors that contribute to climate change. Like, yes, we should stop burning so much CO2 considering that there are much cleaner technologies out there. And, pollution's bad in general. So, yeah, let's stop all the CO2. But at the same time, we don't need to kill off half of the world's population to do that. We just need to implement technologies that have been suppressed, right? So you got your two sides, and then you got folks like us in the middle. It's up to us to get the word out. The mainstream media is not going to cover it. They're not. It upsets the narrative too much. It's bad for their advertisers. It's bad for their stakeholders. It's bad for the oil companies, bad for the political class to find out that, if the human species, if more people wake up to the fact that we've been lied to for so long, it's bad for the status quo. And they have to defend the status quo to defend their power, to defend their profits. It's up to all of us to be the change to make this world a better place. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing, and I hope you are too. If you have any sources, like I said, there's so much information on the history of weather modification. It's a fascinating topic, extremely fascinating. And if this is your first time being exposed to it, you're skeptical, you don't believe me, do your own research. When I was first exposed to these topics, I was extremely skeptical. I thought, wow, that is some batshit crazy tinfoil hat conspiracy theory nonsense. And I was already pretty critical of everything. But the notion that people were playing God with the weather on such a global scale was just incomprehensible to me. And I'll tell you a story to close out here. And this is how I woke up to this. It was 2011, and I was working with Michael C. Rupert as his personal assistant, doing a lot of research, spending a lot of time, way more time than I would ever like to, sitting in front of the computer, reading the most depressing news in the world. Because at the time, Mike was extremely pessimistic about everything. He thought the economy was going to crash. He thought we were going to go back to, he was thinking the zombie apocalypse. He was like, he basically wrote the show The Walking Dead for them before it came out, right? And the point is that I was working with him, and I got to plug in. Well, I think I'm all right. I was extremely skeptical, but I'd been exposed to these ideas. I actually saw a flyer hanging up at the grocery store in Occidental, California, a small little farm town, very eclectic, great little pot-growing, wine-growing community in Sonoma County, one of the most beautiful places in the world. Les Claypool from, what's the band called? I forget. He lives there. It's a great spot. And I was fortunate enough to live there while I was helping Mike set up his doomsday, getting ready for the zombie apocalypse, building like a self-sustaining organic farm there. It was really fun. Well, it was also depressing, scary too. But the point I'm making is every day, because the work I was doing was so depressing, and Mike didn't like starting work until 10 a.m. So I'd work from 10 to 6 every day. So I had my mornings off. I'd get up early and I'd go surfing. And there's this beautiful road you drive from Occidental called Coleman Valley Road. If you ever go to California, I highly recommend you ride your bike on it or drive it. It swoops up into the coastal range mountains and then drops down to the coast. And you have this beautiful 360-degree panoramic view of the sky. Absolutely incredible. And I couldn't help but notice, driving that road, and mind you, this is 2011 in the midst of the huge, horrible drought in California. I couldn't help but notice all the planes and all the lingering, spreading trails. And seeing that day in and day out, something about early morning, like with the sunrise, everything seems more dramatic. I couldn't help but notice it. So I really started studying the sky, really started watching the planes, got some flight tracking software on my smartphone, and I was able to realize pretty quickly, wow, a lot of these planes are unmarked. A lot of these planes, they're flying at various altitudes, yet they all seem to be leaving these big billowing trails. But then, wait, hold on, here's another plane that's not leaving a big billowing trail at all, and it's flying at the same altitude as this plane that threw through the same airspace 20 minutes ago that left a massive trail that turned into this huge cirrus cloud and obscured the whole sky, right? So I became more open to the idea simply by observing the sky. It's important to know for anybody that says, oh, you're not scientific, you're not a PhD, you're not a meteorologist, you're not a climatologist. The essence of science, the foundation of the scientific method is observation. That's it. Like the most basic, like if you want to do science, the foundation of science is observation. You can read all the scientific journals you want, but if you're not paying attention to what's actually going on in the real world, you're not doing science. You're a bookkeeper. You're a librarian. You're regurgitating other people's thoughts. And it's important to note here, as we saw at the beginning of the video, Impact, the Army Air Force's confidential picture history of World War II, that if you want to avoid persistent contrail formation, this is May 1943, the U.S. military already knew how to prevent persistent contrail formation. What do? You fly up or down 1,500 feet to get out of the tropopause where persistent contrail has a chance of forming. So, but I got to finish my story here. The day when I finally became a full-bore believer in the climate engineering agenda, I was with my friends, and we were up on the northern coast, a few hours north of Occidental Bodega Bay. We were surfing this beautiful point break called Secrets. And it was awesome. It was an overhead day, having an awesome time in the water with a bunch of friends. And this huge sea lion came in and charged the lineup. Like, he was pissed off that we were out there. So he came in to fuck with us. And that was enough for me. I'm like, I don't want to get into it with the sea lion. So I paddled into shore. And my buddy John paddled into shore with me. And it was one of those days where the sky was just looking like shit, crisscrossed with the plane trails. And we're laying there. We climbed up onto the hill. We're laying there in the grass, looking down onto the wave, and I saw a plane flying, and it was really low, like extremely low, to the point where it couldn't have been more than 10,000 feet above sea level, nowhere near the tropopause, nowhere near where you'd normally see a persistent contrail form. And I said, hey, John, watch this plane. Just on a whim, I'm like, watch this plane, let's see what happens. And as this plane's flying over, it's a big plane. It's a four-engine jet, very large plane. I don't know what it was. I don't know who was flying it. I didn't have my smartphone with me that day. But as this plane's flying over, no higher than 10,000 feet, boom, sprayers kick on. Kicks out this huge plume of white, and then cuts. And then it flies on for a few seconds, boom. It's on again, huge plume, then it cuts out. Then it's flying, leaving nothing. And then it did that like 3 or 4 times as it flew overhead. So it's leaving these tic-tacs of spray, of something in the atmosphere. And from that day on, I knew that there was something ridiculous going on in the atmosphere. And somebody with a whole lot of money and power and a lot of technology, all these planes, was up to some shady shit. Which prompts the obvious question that's in the title of this video. Why don't we weaken Hurricane Irma and send it back out to sea? And why was Hurricane Harvey the most expensive natural disaster in American history if we have these technologies to affect the weather. Again, it all boils down to disaster capitalism. You know, the debt ceiling debate. Now that we have Harvey, now that they need another $180, $190 billion, well, they're going to pass the debt ceiling. What's going to happen there? The Federal Reserve Bank is going to print a bunch more money, gift it to the government, put us all deeper in debt, devalue the American dollar more, jack up inflation, decrease your salary, decrease your savings, and, you know, they pass it on to consumers. Of course, consumers are all of us, and we're not really consumers, we're producers, we're human beings, we're citizens, and we don't appreciate being lied to. So it's my goal here at Wake Up News, along with Zach Coons, the rest of the team here, we try to tell you the truth. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm signing off. I'll post a link to this article with the video on wakeupnews.net once it's done. The website's new. You know, we got a great following here on Facebook, but we're just getting a web presence going. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I'm signing off. God bless you all. 162 viewers, an hour and 25 minutes into this. If you like it, if you found it informative, you think I'm not totally crazy, share it. But don't just share it. Actually send it to somebody. Like somebody who you think, you know, a friend of yours, you're like, wow, they're kind of open to new ideas. Send them a message. Send them an email. Because if you share it on your wall, odds are not that many people are going to see it. You're not going to get too many likes on videos like this because we're suppressed. It's the way of the world. God bless you all. I'm signing off. 140 shares. I love you. Love you so much. Oh, one more thing. Going live from now on every Wednesday. You know, I'll do these randomly when need arises, but from now on, Wednesday, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Wake Up Wyoming Wednesdays. We'll go live Wednesday. If you ever want to catch the show, Wednesday, 6 p.m. William Walker, what's up, William Walker? He asked, did y'all go to the Bohemian Grove? You know, I actually did go to the Bohemian Grove when I was living in Sonoma County, but I can't really talk about that. Let's just say I wasn't an invited guest. I'm signing off. Y'all take care. One love. Peace.